having finished up the overall narrative story of Israel, from the initial fall in Genesis all the way through the promise of Abraham, the establishment of the nation, the Exodus, all these things going through Samuel and Kings, the rise and fall, eventually the exile, Babylon captivity, and then the story ending with people trickling back into their homeland. There is now a 400-year gap in this moment of history until Jesus comes and the Gospels begin recording the account of the establishment of God's kingdom through Jesus. But here in this moment in the Old Testament, the Bible changes gears, and quite dramatically, in fact. Everything you've read up to this point has really been what we'd call narrative or story. Besides some laws in the Torah, you've been able to read it one book after another, and it follows a kind of a chronological order full of real characters who do things like any good story. And there's a plot, there's scenes, there's villains, all these kind of things. It's a story. All these books have told you the narrative of Israel. Again, that's been the sort of dominant theme up to this point. But now we're going to move into a different section of the Old Testament that's actually a collection of writings that reflect who these people were, how they thought, what they were thinking and feeling, what issues they were wrestling with. And what you'll find is these books are different and unique because they're not written as stories necessarily or accounts of history, but in actually a lot of different various styles of writing, including poetry, songs, parables, metaphors, and all of them are just working with how the people were thinking, what they were wrestling with. So let me give you a little picture. Imagine if in 2,000 years or something, you wanted to know all about Americans in the 21st century. Well, you could start by reading our history books, the account of things that happened, and that would give you a good idea of America. But it wouldn't really tell you everything you want to know, would it? It wouldn't tell you everything about who we are as people and everything. So along with our history books, you'd also want to examine things from our culture, our movies, our music, popular novels. You would want to see what are we talking about and wrestling with on social media in the 21st century. And that'll give you more than just here's what happened. It'll give you an insight into how these people think and feel and what kind of things they were wrestling with. So the writings of Israel, this collection of sort of odd, interesting, somewhat unrelated books, give us a glimpse into the minds and attitudes and thinking of these people, both about God and who he is and what he's doing, and into other things like love and romance and even the meaning of life. And all these books reflect Israel's history at some point. So by understanding the overall story first, which we've done, we can place these books and see how they fit and how their writings reflect on what was going on in their lives. Now, the most important theme that runs through all the writings is that true wisdom comes from being loyal to God. And some people even label these books wisdom literature, although, we're not really sure where, like the Psalms might fit that. So writings, but wisdom coming from the Lord is at the center of all these books. You'll read the phrase, the fear of the Lord, a lot. And that's what this is speaking to, respecting and honoring God, trusting him as a source. The Israelite people are in the middle of wrestling with the ideas of success and failure, blessings and curses, health and prosperity, exile and slavery versus having the land. All of this stuff that you've seen out of their history, at the center of all is the question of how do we seek and find God's wisdom and live according to his word and who he truly is, to live by truth and live the right way. And this all begins with this really misunderstood and difficult story of a man named Job. So I want to start by looking at the story of Job, and we're going to walk through it a bit and kind of get a picture of what's happening here. But I want you to see Job within the context of the way that Israel was writing things to deal with issues in their world. Now, there's a lot of questions about Job, questions that we can't answer. We don't know when it was written. We don't know who wrote it. There's some scholars that think Job might be the oldest book in the Old Testament. There's some that think it was written during the exile. We just don't know. There's some that would suggest that maybe Job even has roots outside of Israel. Again, we don't actually know. Job is also a bit of a handful to read because it's composed of a mix of poetry, some stories, but a lot of speeches that go back and forth between Job and his friends. I've often said, like when you're in high school and you're forced to read Shakespeare and you're like, I feel like I know what some of these words mean, but I'm kind of lost. Job can feel that way. Very flowery, poetic. what I would say is with Job, you have to be careful because it's probably, and there's debate here, but where Job is placed and how it fits, it's not placed within the history books. It's placed within the writings, the poetry. So it's very likely that Job is not an actual recording of real historical events. Did someone named Job actually live? Possibly, possibly not. This might just be more of a metaphor. It doesn't change the truth or what the story is getting at. You might say like, well, if it's not true, it's not real. Well, no, that's not the case. Another famous philosopher named Plato wrote a book called Discourses, where he argued philosophy by putting different philosophers like his mentor Socrates, gave them speeches arguing back and forth. Job feels very similar. Now, what makes that difficult is you also have to know that there's different characters in Job, and not all of them are representing the truth. So when you're reading Job, it's like, well, the Bible says, well, hold on, who's speaking and what are they saying? A lot of the stuff that's being said in the book of Job is meant to be understood as bad wisdom. So you got to be careful how you're reading this book. But at the core of Job, here's what Job is not about. The questions of, is it historical? Is there really a Job? Is there not one? Don't matter nearly as much as what are they actually discussing? What idea is being brought to the surface in this book? And here it is. Put simply, it's this age-old question: why do bad things happen to good people? That's the question. Not why do bad things happen at all. It's not wrestling with the problem of evil in general, but it's a question about fairness, about people not getting what they deserve, which was a massively huge, important question in their culture in the ancient Near East. And in many ways, in much parts of the East today and other parts of the world. A key phrase that I want you to be familiar with, it's not in the book of Job, but we understand it's the way that works from outside of it. It's known as the retribution principle. Fancy word for really a simple idea. Retribution, getting what you deserve, right? Payback. This is the belief in life that God is fair and ordered a just world. Therefore, the retribution principle is the idea that good people receive good things, blessing, and evil people receive evil curses. We reap what we sow, right? And it's important to know that this is not just a Bible thing, it's a human thing. The retribution principle was all over the ancient world. All the people in the ancient Near East accepted it. All the major religions of the time wrestled with it, and many still to today. In many parts of the East, you still have this retribution principle existing. It's known as karma. You get your comeuppance. You get what you deserve. What you do will come back to you by the gods. The gods will give you what you deserve. And it was a core aspect of how they saw the world and how it worked. And so if you do evil things, evil comes upon you. If you do good things will come upon you. It's simply how things work. Right? Well, there's a problem, a tension that we all feel, because like all experiences in our lives, we know that it doesn't always work out that way. Like in sport, sometimes you work hard, you win. Sometimes you can work hard and you still lose. And other biblical authors complain to God about how it seems like great, wonderful people suffer. And sometimes the worst, like that person's a jerk and they won the lottery. God, what are you doing? What's the deal? And so this is what Job is really about. Job is a philosophical discussion, if you will. It's a writing attempting to argue with the question: how can a just God allow people to suffer? If you are given what you deserve, then why do good people suffer? And this is the tension and question that the book of Job tackles, and not head on, not in a direct sort of expository preaching way like I'm doing right now. Rather, in a story, in a wisdom, poetic way, the ancient culture knew best, by having different characters argue. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the structure of Job and kind of show the way the book comes together. And you'll see it really by looking at the different characters in the book. And it starts, there's a prologue in the first 3 chapters, which is the story section. And in this section, the Satan, not Satan. The word Satan is a Hebrew word that means adversary. It's not a personal name. And in Hebrew, the definite article, the, is attached to it. So it says the adversary. This could be the spiritual being we know as the devil. It might just be the author's way of bringing a character in that represents a different point of view. We don't know. It's okay. The Satan comes before God. And what matters is the point that he wants to make regarding the retribution principle. He questions the effectiveness. He says, listen, this Job guy doesn't fear you for nothing. He only is a good person because you give him good things. You're dangling a carrot on a stick. This doesn't actually create true goodness in people. It's In fact, it's the opposite. It's only acting good to get something. It's selfishness, right? So the whole point is unjust. The Satan is saying, God, the way you're running the world is stupid. You're making a mistake. This isn't actually what you should do. And so the Satan clearly believes and accepts the principle as a reality, but thinks it's a bad way to operate. How many times have you maybe heard this? People make this accusation of Christians. You only go to church and act good so you can get to heaven, right? You're in it for yourself. Would you serve and be loyal to God even if there was nothing you got out of it? The principle of promising good for good only makes fake, sort of selfish robots, mice in a cage following the rules to get the cheese. It's a bad way to operate. This is the Satan's argument. So God says, okay, let's test it. Go ahead. And in this really difficult passage to make sense of, the Satan is allowed to take everything from Job. Again, are we reading this as literal history, or is this the author setting a scene in order to deal with a principle? It's a difficult question. But Job loses everything. And Job's response to this series of calamities is important for us to understand. First, his wife comes to him and says, why don't you just curse God and die? Are you still holding on to your integrity? Which makes sense when you understand Job's wife believes that Job is an innocent man. She believes that Job has done nothing wrong, and yet he's suffering. So from her point of view, God is not worth following, because the retribution principle says that Job should be getting good things, not bad things. So her perspective is, this God you serve is not living up to his end of the bargain. You should walk away from him. But Job won't do that. Instead, he finds himself questioning the situation. He gives a long lament in chapter 3 where he basically wants to die and finds himself deeply troubled and confused. Why is this happening? I lived up to my end of the deal, he thinks, but God, it seems like you haven't. And what we see here is that Job also fully believes in the principle of good for good and evil for evil. But he's convinced in his heart that he's not evil and has done nothing to deserve this. Therefore, there's been a mistake. Somebody has wrongly accused him. Somebody has maybe whispered in something wrong in God's ear. Something is wrong. There's an injustice at play, and Job is perplexed and confused. And then at issue is his own integrity, because in a world that believes in the retribution principle, karma, you go to India today, they still believe it, you get what you deserve. So if you're suffering, it's probably your fault. Well, enter Job's friends, starting in chapter 4 all the way through chapter 27 of this long section where Job's friends come to comfort him, I guess. What great friends they are. You've just lost everything, including your family. Let's talk about why it's your fault, which is really what they do. They come to him and say, Job, you need to understand that according to the retribution principle, what you're suffering must be your fault. You have this guy, Eliphaz, who points out how obviously the retribution principle is certain. No one is innocent before God, Job. No one. So just apologize and get your stuff back, which was Satan's accusation, right? That people just do the right thing to get their stuff. Job, whatever happened is your fault. You brought this upon yourself. Just apologize. Everything will be fine. And then his other friend Bildad comes and he kind of uses natural philosophy and look at the world around you. You'll notice that when you sow evil, you reap evil. So Job, you've obviously sown evil. Just, say you're sorry. And this, ticks Job off. He's like, no. Finally, his buddy Zophar speaks up about forgiveness and how God will be merciful if he just repents of the sin that's in his heart. Really saying the same thing. Job, obviously, all this bad stuff has happened to you because you did something wrong. This is your fault. What they are arguing for is their side of the retribution principle, karma. God is righteous. He doesn't lie. He doesn't make mistakes. So if you're suffering, it must be you who deserve this. You obviously did something. How dare you accuse him of being unfaithful, Job? You must have done something evil because the wicked suffer. Stop deceiving yourself. You must be at fault here. Or if not you, it could have been your children who are great sinners. We don't know, right? Job just can't win. So they plead with him, but he's not into it. He's like, no, I won't do it. Job says, I will not repent of something I've done nothing wrong. And in chapters 27 to 31, Job pleads his case, pleads his innocence. To all of this, Job feels he doesn't want to argue with his friends anymore. So he takes his case to God himself, right? In 27, he swears he's innocent. There's been some kind of mistake, or God is just being cruel because he has been wrongly convicted. He doesn't deserve this. Again, this is all about justice and getting what you deserve, right? He thinks back on how blessed he was and how tormented he is now. This just isn't right. It isn't fair. And then he ends by recounting how he's tried to be righteous before God. He stayed pure with regard to women. He didn't lie or steal. He treated everyone at work fairly. And above all, he never worshiped other gods. So he has done nothing to deserve what he is now experiencing. And he ends by essentially asking God to come and tell him what he's done wrong to deserve all this suffering. Bring forth the charges. Let me face my accusers, right? He demands God come and defend himself, having, falsely convicted an innocent man. So you see all this argument about the retribution principle. The wife says God has failed. The friends say Job has failed. Job is just throwing up his hands in the air. I don't know. The Satan is saying this whole principle is a bad way to operate God. And then God responds, sort of. Chapter 32 through 42, 38 through 42, there's this really difficult passage. Who is this that challenges my wisdom? Brace yourself like a man. I have questions for you, God says. But here's what's so interesting about this book. When God begins to respond, both Job and his friends, and probably the Satan as well, are all waiting in anticipation to see who God is going to side with. Are the friends right? Has Job done something to deserve this? Is Job right? Has he actually been wrongly accused? Is the Satan right? Is this principle just stupid? Is his wife right? Is God actually unjust and Job is serving the wrong God? The answer is none of them. And here's why. Because none of them understand who God is and his ways. Yikes. They're all thinking through human wisdom. Job does not deserve his suffering, but neither is God unjust because of it. So God asks this long list of questions. Job, where were you when I spread out the heavens and formed the foundations of the earth, right? Like, Job, where are you in the depths and mysteries of my universe? And these are a series of questions that clearly show that Job doesn't have full understanding or perspective of who God is and how he works. Now, when you read this section, it can be almost a little bit frustrating because it can almost feel like God is kind of avoiding or maybe not answering Job's question. Here's the deal. God isn't answering Job's question. Job wants to know exactly why he's suffering. God doesn't tell him. God doesn't give a clear, specific, articulate explanation for why suffering happens. That's actually not what the book of Job is about. So in that sense, it can almost feel like Job is kind of letting us down. We're not getting an answer, but it does give us a different answer, an important one. And here is the answer it does give Job, his friends, and everyone else reading the book. Rather than declare any of them right, Job, his friends, the Satan, his wife, instead, the book of Job calls into question the entire principle and the folly of how humans think. That God never actually promised that being good meant nothing bad would ever happen, nor that he would always send evil upon people who acted evilly. The point of Job is not to explain evil, is not to give this clear answer for why sometimes good people suffer. The point of Job is to speak into the ancient world, and probably the world still today, and say, the retribution principle is not real. It is not actually God's wisdom. It's human wisdom. We made it up and we try to hold God to it. It's a sign of our faulty human wisdom, thinking God operates by always making sure everything is perfectly fair and good always equals good and evil equal. That isn't the world we live in. Instead, Jesus said, God causes his sun to rise on the righteous and the unrighteous, the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. And God's ways are higher and more complex. We all want a better answer, but sometimes there isn't one, and making up a fairness rule doesn't help. Rather, at the end of the day, again, this book doesn't address the problem of evil. It doesn't tell us why God allows suffering. Why is there evil in the world? That's a different conversation. Instead, it denies the principle of retribution, of thinking karma is true. Karma is not part of God's economy. It calls us to trust and be loyal to God, even when we don't understand, but to remember that if you're suffering, number one, don't assume it's guilt. Don't assume it's your fault. Don't see somebody else suffering and say, well, they must have done it. But also, on the other hand, don't just turn around and say, well, God is being unfair to me. There's no easy answer for suffering, but it isn't always the result of someone sinning. Yes, our actions have consequences. The Bible talks about that. We're going to get into that again. In the Proverbs is all about that. But there's a difference between talking about cause and effect, run into a wall, hurt your face, and saying God gives evil to people who do bad things and gives good all the time. This isn't the way the world works. Sometimes he does, and sometimes he doesn't. And so if we assume people are guilty or evil when they're suffering, man, we're making a mistake. And if we assume that God is unjust because we haven't been getting what we think we deserve, we're holding God to a promise he never made. And the final scene is Job recognizing that he and his friends don't completely understand God as much as they think, and he needs to trust that God is in control and that, no one's guilty here. It's just life. And I think that's the great message of this book. Sometimes evil and suffering just happen. It's not our place to question God's justice or righteousness in those moments, but to continue trusting and believing that he's good and worthy of our faithfulness, which is a message Jesus will pick up years later. And let me end with this, and I think this might be the most important thing. It's not really part of this class, but I want to say it anyway. Praise God that the retribution principle isn't true. So for the Israelites to celebrate this, and obviously we'll pick it up in the New Testament, if you and I only got what we deserved, we would all be in a lot of trouble, because all of us deserve, as Paul will say in Ephesians, we're all people deserving wrath. And yet out of his great love, he died for us. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So Job undermines the idea of karma. It's not true. God doesn't just give what we deserve, which is beautiful. That's the beauty of the gospel we'll see in the New Testament, is that you and I are not given what we deserve. I don't want to live in a world that the retribution principle is true, because I'm not innocent and neither are you. And so Job wants to undermine that principle and paint a different picture of God, one that causes us to step back in our suffering and not cast blame, not cast accusations, but to accept that I live in a broken world, but also to see a God who is good and loves me and gives me good things even when I don't deserve it. The sun rises and rain needed for life falls on the unjust and the unrighteous as much as the righteous and just. And I have been unrighteous, and so have you. So the book of Job sets the stage for God's grace to be shown in the New Testament, making a great book. All right, so that's the first of the wisdom writings of Israel, and we're going to pick up in the next video with a very different book that speaks of God's life and speaks of wisdom in a much different way, the book of Psalm. We'll see that next video. Thanks, guys.